8 inches. That's the measurement at the heart of this story. Not 8 miles of restored coastline, not 8 years of cleanup work, not $8 billion of federal intervention. 8 inches of granite placed on a river bottom, and one of the most complex biological systems on the eastern seaboard started pulling itself back from the edge of total collapse. I'm Tom Marsh, and this is the story of how the Chesapeake Bay died from the bottom up, and how a decision to stop fighting the mud and start building above it changed everything. By 2011, the oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay had dropped to 0.3% of what it had been in the 1800s, not 3%. 0.3%. Out of an ecosystem that had once hosted one of the densest shellfish populations on Earth, almost nothing was left. And when those animals vanished, they didn't just take themselves with them. They took the water clarity, the oxygen, the underwater grasses, the crab populations, the fish, the fishing towns, the jobs. A system that had run cleanly and continuously for 6,000 years shut down in a matter of decades, and most of the people living around it had no real understanding of what had actually been lost until the consequences were sitting on top of them. The Chesapeake Bay has a ratio that doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet. 14 square miles of land drains into every single square mile of water. 6 states worth of rivers, farm ditches, city gutters, and stream runoff pouring their contents into one shallow estuary every single day without pause. Soil, nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, all of it funneling into a body of water that is, in geological terms, barely a puddle. Any other estuary on Earth would have choked on that load long ago. The Chesapeake didn't, because for 6,000 years it had a filtration system running around the clock, not a man-made one, not a treatment plant. An architecture of living organisms covering the bay floor so densely that ships had to navigate around the reefs to avoid running aground. In 1701, a Swiss traveler recorded that the abundance of oysters was unlike anything he had seen in Europe. He wrote that there were whole banks of them so thick that his own boat struck a reef and sat stuck for 2 hours, waiting for the tide to lift it free. That wasn't a curiosity, that was the machine doing its job. Those reefs weren't just big, they were tall. Each generation of oysters cemented its shells onto the shells of the generation before it, building upward layer by layer, century by century, until the structures broke the surface at low tide and in some places rose high enough into the water column to threaten the hull of a vessel. The height was not incidental, it was the entire engineering strategy. Here is why that matters. Sediment settles. That is what it does. In a bay with 14 square miles of land draining into every square mile of water, the sediment never stops coming. It sinks, it buries whatever sits on the bottom. And an oyster sitting flat on a mud surface is a dead oyster. So over thousands of years, oysters evolved a solution: build faster than the mud can rise. Cement yourselves into rigid three-dimensional towers and walls that punch up through the silt layer and into the clean, oxygenated, fast-moving water above. The height kept the reef surface in moving water. The jagged edges of the shells created small turbulent currents that deflected settling particles the way a boulder in a stream deflects leaves. The reef was self-cleaning. The mud couldn't land. And as long as the mud couldn't land, new oyster larvae drifting through the water column had a clean, hard surface to attach to, which meant the next generation could grow, which meant the reef grew taller, which meant the mud still couldn't reach it. Think of it like a city that builds upwards specifically because the ground floor floods. As long as the upper floors stay dry, the whole structure functions. The moment something forces the building flat, the flood takes everything. And then an oyster filtration system of that scale does something else entirely. One adult oyster filters up to 50 gallons of water a day. At the population densities that existed before commercial harvesting began, the entire oyster population of the Chesapeake Bay could filter all 18 trillion gallons of the bay's water in roughly 3 to 4 days. The whole bay, run through living gills, every single week. That filtration stripped the water of algae, suspended sediment, and organic particles. The water stayed clear. Clear water let sunlight reach the bottom. Sunlight at the bottom meant underwater grasses could grow eelgrass, widgeon grass, and those grasses anchored the bottom sediment with their root systems. Crabs hid in the grasses. Fish followed. The whole web held together because one organism at the base was running the machinery. In 1884, watermen in Maryland alone pulled 15 million bushels of oysters out of the bay in a single season. Billions of individual animals hauled up by heavy steel dredges dragged across the bottom at speed. The dredge is a steel frame with iron teeth and a chain-link bag, weighing hundreds of pounds, towed across the reef. It doesn't harvest selectively. It demolishes architecture. Every pass sheared off the top of the reef, the living, growing surface and scattered shell and rubble across the mud. The oysters were taken, yes, but the height was taken too. And without the height, the first domino fell. The sediment that the reefs had been outrunning for 6,000 years suddenly had no obstacle. The flattened reefs were now sitting at the same level as the surrounding mud, in the slowest, deadest water at the very bottom of the water column, what hydrologists call the boundary layer, where current speed drops to near nothing and suspended particles simply fall out and land. Millimeters of silt accumulated on the broken shell, then centimeters, the hard surfaces that oyster larvae needed to attach to, disappeared under soft, suffocating mud. And here is where the cascade becomes irreversible on its own terms. Oyster larvae are microscopic, free-floating animals. They drift in the water column for about 2 weeks before they need to find a hard, clean surface to settle on. No surface, no attachment, no new oyster. The burial of the shell didn't just kill the existing animals. It severed the reproductive cycle. Billions of larvae drifted, found nothing but mud, and died. The population couldn't replace itself. Fewer oysters meant less filtration. Less filtration meant the water stayed cloudy, loaded with algae that no one was pumping out anymore. At their peak, the oyster population could filter the entire bay in 3 to 4 days. Once the population had crashed, that same job took a full year. The nutrient-rich runoff from farms and cities that the oysters had been stripping out continuously now sat in the water column for months. It fed enormous blooms of algae. When the algae died and sank, bacteria consumed the dead cells and burned through the dissolved oxygen in the process. Oxygen levels dropped below 2 milligrams per liter, the threshold where almost nothing can survive, and dead zones spread across the bay floor every summer. The cloudy, algae-choked water blocked the sunlight. The underwater grasses died back. Their roots had been anchoring the bottom sediment. When the grasses died, that sediment was released back into the water, making the cloudiness worse, killing more grass, releasing more sediment. A perfect feedback loop, spinning faster with every cycle. In 1949 and 1959, 2 parasitic diseases entered the bay. Under different circumstances, a dense, healthy, genetically diverse population, the oysters might have evolved resistance over a few generations. But this population wasn't dense or healthy. It was flattened, buried, oxygen-starved, and scattered into fragments too isolated to breed their way out. The diseases swept through what remained. The survivors had neither the numbers nor the genetic diversity to fight back. The system was now locked. Flat reefs got buried. Buried reefs couldn't recruit larvae. Low recruitment meant weak filtration. Weak filtration meant cloudy water. Cloudy water killed the grasses. Dead grasses released sediment. More sediment buried whatever remained. The diseases kept the population too low to break the loop. Every year, the system stayed in this state. Recovery got harder. The bay wasn't slowly dying. It was actively maintaining its own death, a machine running in reverse, each failure reinforcing the next. By 2003, the commercial oyster harvest had fallen to 50,000 bushels. In 1884, the number had been 15 million. The oystering towns hollowed out. Crisfield, Oxford, communities that had built their entire economies on the shell. 25,000 people had worked the harvest at the peak. By the early 2000s, There was almost no one left. For decades, the restoration efforts targeted the obvious symptom. State agencies dredged up ancient fossil shells from deep in the bay and spread them across the depleted bottom. Fresh shells from shucking houses were laid in thin, flat layers across the mud. In some years, Maryland planted 2 to 5 million bushels of shell, spending $1 to $2 million annually. It didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is exactly the reason the reefs had collapsed in the first place. A thin layer of shell sitting flat on a mud bottom is a target. It sits in the slowest water right where the sediment falls. Within a season, sometimes within weeks, the mud covered it. Larvae couldn't find it. And in many cases, the areas where those shells were planted were still open to commercial dredging. So on the rare occasions when oysters did manage to settle and begin growing, the dredges came through and tore them off before they could build any height. The state was filling a hole while someone else kept digging it out. Millions of dollars spent. The bay's trajectory didn't change. The approach failed because it was treating the symptom. The symptom was a shortage of oysters. The cause was a shortage of three-dimensional structure tall enough to stay above the mud. In 2014, a coalition of federal and state agencies and nonprofit organizations signed the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement and committed to something that had never been attempted at this scale: rebuilding the actual physical floor of the estuary from scratch, not with shells, but with stone. The plan was called the 10 Tributaries Initiative, 5 rivers in Maryland, 5 in Virginia. The goal was to permanently restore oyster habitat in each one by 2025. And the word that mattered most in that plan was permanently. These were not going to be harvest grounds. They were going to be sanctuaries. No dredges, no extraction of any kind, ever. The Army Corps of Engineers mapped the river bottoms with sonar, identifying the firmest ground with the best water flow and salinity. Then they brought in barges loaded with quarried granite, crushed concrete, and fossilized shell. In the Piankatank River, building just 25 acres of reef required more than 29,000 tons of granite, loaded across 9.5 barges. The stone was lowered onto the river bottom and arranged into reef bases that rose 8 to 15 inches above the mud. 8 to 15 inches. That is the entire fix. At that height, the stone sits in moving water, not in the dead boundary layer at the very bottom. The jagged granite surfaces create turbulence that deflects settling sediment the same way a rock in a stream deflects leaves. The mud cannot land. The surface stays clean. And a clean, hard surface and oxygenated moving water is exactly what an oyster larva needs. At the Horn Point Hatchery on Maryland's eastern shore, scientists were breeding oysters specifically selected for resistance to the 2 diseases that had been devastating the wild population for 50 years. They took the toughest surviving adults, animals, that had lived through infection in the most hostile, high salinity conditions and bred them in controlled tanks. The larvae were settled onto cleaned, recycled shells, where they attached and hardened within 48 hours. The industry term for this is spat-on shell, living oysters pre-attached to a surface ready to deploy. The Oyster Recovery Partnership loaded those spat-covered shells onto shallow draft boats, navigated to GPS coordinates matching the sonar maps exactly, and blasted the living shells onto the granite bases using high-pressure water hoses. They were painting the stone with biology. Disease-resistant animals placed directly onto sediment-proof foundations inside waters where no dredge would ever be permitted to touch them. Harris Creek, a tributary on Maryland's eastern shore, became the flagship site. Before the restoration, it had 2 acres of functioning reef remaining out of a historical 1,500. The team built 348 acres of new reef and planted 2.49 billion oysters. The total cost for Harris Creek alone was $29.06 million. Then they waited. The monitoring protocol required check-ins at 3 years and 6 years. The oysters survived disease seasons, survived winter, survived the massive freshwater floods of 2018 that dropped the salinity and stressed every living thing in the tributaries. The stone held. the oysters held. In 2021, the 6-year data came back. 343 out of 348 acres passed. 98.6% of the restored reef met every benchmark for density, biomass, and the presence of multiple age classes. The oysters weren't just surviving, they were breeding. New generations were settling onto the old ones, building height, cementing together, doing exactly what their ancestors had done for 6,000 years before someone dragged a dredge across them. Harris Creek was declared the first fully restored tributary in the Chesapeake Bay, and then the cascade that had been running in reverse for a century started running forward. The filtration came back first. Reef density in Harris Creek reached levels where the oyster population could filter the entire water volume of the creek in under 10 days during summer. In Virginia's Lynnhaven River, where high salinity water let the oysters grow faster, monitoring teams recorded 3,400 adults per square meter. Water that had been opaque for decades started clearing. The clear water let sunlight reach the bottom again, and the grasses came back. In 2018, aerial surveys recorded 108,000 acres of underwater grasses across the Chesapeake Bay, the highest figure in the modern record, and nearly triple the historic low of 38,000 acres measured in the mid-1980s. The same feedback loop that had killed them was now feeding them. Clearer water meant more grass. More grass meant more roots anchoring sediment. Less suspended sediment meant even clearer water. The loop was running the right direction. The oysters were also pulling nitrogen out of the system. The animals trapped nitrogen in their shells and tissues, and the dense microbial communities living in the reef structure convert dissolved nitrogen into harmless gas that escapes into the atmosphere. Harris Creek's reefs alone remove an estimated 20,000 pounds of nitrogen every year. Over a decade, the projection is 1 million pounds, the equivalent of pulling 20,000 bags of garden fertilizer out of the water and making them disappear. In the summer of 2023, the dead zone that had haunted the Chesapeake Bay for decades shrank to its smallest recorded size since monitoring began in 1985. Just over half a cubic mile. The long-term average had been nearly a full cubic mile. The water was holding oxygen again. The stone architecture itself became a city. Researchers documented over 50 species colonizing the Harris Creek reefs. Hooked mussels, barnacles, anemones, sea squirts, with more than 5,000 individual organisms per square meter on the densest structures, not counting the oysters themselves. Juvenile blue crabs, the species that drives the bay's most iconic commercial fishery, showed a 300% higher survival rate on the restored three-dimensional reefs compared to the flat bare mud. They finally had somewhere to hide from predators, and the population responded immediately. Even though the sanctuary reefs are permanently closed to harvest, the spillover effect has driven commercial oyster harvests in Maryland to triple over the past 2 decades. Economic models project that the mature reefs in the Choptank River system alone will generate $23 million annually and support over 300 jobs. The $29 million investment in Harris Creek pays back in regional economic return in under 2 years. For context, the average cost of highway construction in Maryland runs around $6 million per mile. The restoration of Harris Creek, 348 acres of self-sustaining biological filtration, removing 1 million pounds of nitrogen per decade, supporting 50-plus species, tripling crab survival, and generating $23 million a year in economic activity costs roughly the same as paving 5 miles of road. The project has now expanded to all 10 original tributaries, plus an 11th bonus site in Virginia. Over 2,400 acres of reef have been built. 7.5 billion oysters have been planted, and in the highest performing Virginia sites, the reefs are beginning to sustain themselves without hatchery input. Wild larvae settling on the stone, building new layers, growing upward. The way the system was designed to work for 6,000 years before anyone interrupted it. There is something worth sitting with here. The Chesapeake Bay didn't collapse because of a catastrophe. No single disaster struck it. No storm, no spill, no act of God. It collapsed because of a subtraction. Someone removed the height from the bottom, and the physics of sedimentation did the rest. Quietly, incrementally, over decades, until almost nothing remained. And every fix that tried to restore the bay by laying flat shell into the mud failed for the exact same mechanical reason the bay had broken in the first place. You cannot fight sedimentation by sitting inside it. The fix that finally worked didn't fight the mud. It outbuilt it, 8 inches of stone placed in the right location, protected from the dredge and seeded with animals bred tough enough to survive. That was the entire intervention. Everything else, the clear water, the grasses, the crabs, the oxygen, the nitrogen removal, the economic recovery that was just the system doing what it was always built to do. Once someone gave it back the one structural variable it had lost. The oysters didn't need to be taught to filter, or to cement their shells, or to build upward away from the mud. That knowledge was never gone. It was waiting in the biology, exactly where 6,000 years of evolution had placed it. We didn't restore the Chesapeake Bay. We returned the architecture that made restoration possible, and we got out of the way. There is one more thing I find remarkable about this story. The name Chesapeake comes from a Powhatan word Chesapeake, meaning something close to Great Shellfish Bay. The people who gave it that name lived around those reefs. They fished from boats that had to navigate around structures tall enough to wreck a hull. They named the whole place after what the oysters made it. Then the reefs vanished, and the name stayed. For a century and a half, the bay carried a name that described something that no longer existed inside it. Now, for the first time in living memory, the name and the place are starting to match again. If you want to know what you can do with that, I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think restoring species like this, permanently, even at the cost of closing areas to harvest, is the right trade? Because that question is at the heart of a lot of what's happening in coastal ecosystems right now, and the answer isn't simple. If this kind of story matters to you, share it. These are the conversations worth having, and subscribe, because there are more stories like this than you'd think, and I have plenty more to tell you. I'm Tom Marsh. Thanks for watching.